They threw her and her 3 children onto the street without knowing the secret she carried, that the very land they stole back from her was worth $200 million. And here's the part no one ever saw coming. A woman who once counted pennies to buy milk for her kids was standing on top of a fortune her husband's family had been sitting on, blindly, for more than half a century. Sounds like a fairy tale? It isn't. This is the kind of story that can only come from real American life, where a missing signature or a forgotten deed can turn a family from secure to homeless in a single afternoon. But what makes this story unforgettable isn't the money, it's the journey. A young widow, shamed and cast out, somehow rises from the very bottom and transforms her pain into a haven for hundreds of other women just like her. Her name is Hannah Carter, and it all began on the rainiest, loneliest day of her life, the day she buried the only man who ever. The day Hannah Carter's life split clean in two didn't make a sound. It didn't warn her, didn't tremble the ground, didn't send a single sign ahead of time. It arrived quietly, like most life-changing days do in America, wrapped inside an ordinary Tuesday morning. At 10:17 a.m., the construction site where her husband Luke was working reported a collapse. By 10:40, her phone rang. By 11:12, she was a widow. And by sundown, she was carrying 3 children through a storm that felt far bigger than the weather. People think tragedy comes loud, but more often it comes the way it came for Hannah. A soft knock on the door, a man with his hat in his hands, and a sentence so gentle it shatters you. She remembered the way Jenna, her 12-year-old, froze in the hallway, how Aiden kept asking if Dad was hurt just a little, and how little Miles didn't understand any of it, only that his mother suddenly couldn't breathe right. That afternoon, the town moved like a slow river around her. Neighbors brought casseroles, co-workers offered rides, and everyone repeated those same 7 words. If you need anything, just call me. But grief moves differently for the people left behind. It isn't sharp at first. It's heavy. It settles on the chest like an extra winter. And by the time they lowered Luke's coffin into the soaked Montana ground, 2 days later, Hannah felt like she was sinking right with it. It should have been the moment where family steps in to hold you together, but Hannah wasn't that lucky. The Carter family stood across the churchyard like a wall. Wayne, Marlene, and Luke's older brother Derek, their black umbrellas lined up like they were attending a business deal rather than a burial. There was no embrace, no shared tears, just stiff nods and a silence so cold it made the rain feel warm. Hannah had learned long ago that she would never quite fit into the Carter legacy. She came from renters, not landowners, from shift work, not inheritance, from a world where people introduced themselves by first name, not last name. Luke never cared, but his parents always did. When he was alive, he kept their distance from turning cruel. But grief changes the balance of every family. And when the person who loved you the loudest is no longer there to speak your worth out loud, others begin to rewrite your story for you. That night, after the funeral, Hannah washed dishes alone in the farmhouse kitchen. The children slept on the couch, wrapped in blankets too thin for a night like this. The house felt foreign, like it was holding its breath. Buildings do that, especially old ones. They know when the person who truly belonged there is gone. She stood at the sink, fingers numb, staring through the window at the dark stretch of land. Luke once called our forever. And for the first time, a thought crept in that she had never allowed before. What if forever only lasts as long as the person promising it? She didn't have time to unpack the fear behind that question, because it was answered for her less than an hour later. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the hallway. Firm, definitive, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission. It announces authority. When she opened the door, Wayne, Marlene, and Derek stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Their faces were carved from the same cold stone they'd worn at the gravesite. The conversation that followed would stay with her for years, not because of how loud it was, but because of how calmly they dismantled the life she thought she still had. They explained that the house wasn't hers, the land wasn't hers. Her name had never been added to any deed, and Luke hadn't been the legal owner. "You and the children can stay 1 week," Wayne said, his voice flat, as if discussing a rental agreement instead of a home his son had built memories in. "After that, we'll be changing the locks." It wasn't rage Hannah felt in that moment. It was the quiet humiliation of realizing that everything she thought was solid could disappear with a single sentence. She had heard of women being erased from their own lives after losing a partner. 1 in 3 widows in America loses at least one major asset within the first year, but she never thought she'd become part of that statistic. Not like this. Not so fast. Not with 3 children watching her. But hidden inside that pain was the first lesson she would later look back on. Sometimes life doesn't break you because you're weak. Sometimes it breaks you because you're being moved somewhere stronger. She didn't know it yet. But this night, the worst night she'd ever lived, was simply the beginning of a path that had been quietly waiting for her long before she ever married into the Carter name. With her children asleep and the storm pressing against the windows, Hannah packed only what she could carry. She left behind wedding gifts, furniture, photo albums, even Luke's old guitar, the one he used to sing the kids to sleep with. She walked out of the farmhouse with nothing but 3 bags, 3 children, and a cedar box Luke's grandmother once kept in the attic. She didn't know what was inside. She didn't know it held the first threads of a truth that would one day shake the entire Carter legacy to the core. All she knew was that everything familiar had been stripped away, and something new, something she couldn't see yet, was waiting in the dark. And that is where the fall ends, and the real journey begins. Now we step into part 2, where survival becomes a daily battle, and Hannah learns just. When Hannah drove away from the Carter farmhouse that night, she didn't feel homeless yet. Shock has a way of numbing the truth. It wasn't until she unlocked the door of a rundown cabin on the outskirts of Butte, a place so cheap the landlord didn't bother asking questions, that reality finally settled on her shoulders. The cabin smelled like old pine and mildew. The heater rattled like it was complaining. The kitchen sink dripped in a slow, irritating rhythm. It was the kind of place people stayed when they were passing through or hiding from something, but for Hannah, it was the only place she could afford, with $57 left in her checking account. The kids tried to make the best of it. Jenna found a broom and started sweeping the floors, even though the dust kept floating back down. Aidan lined the sleeping bags in a neat row across the living room, pretending it was a campout. Miles asked if this was their new fort, and for a moment Hannah let him believe it. Sometimes mothers protect their children with stories before they can protect them with stability. Life in poverty moves differently. It asks something from you every minute. For Hannah, mornings began before dawn. She'd pack school lunches with whatever she could stretch: peanut butter on sandwich bread from the discount rack, apples bruised on one side but still good if you cut around the spots. Then she'd drive the kids to school in a car whose engine light had been on for months, praying it wouldn't choose today to die. After drop-off, she worked the early shift at the grocery store, scanning items and bagging groceries for customers who sometimes looked at her without really seeing her. In the afternoons, she raced home, reheated canned soup, helped with homework, and tucked Miles in for a short nap before heading out again, this time to the diner. 12-hour days became 14. 14 became 16. She slept in pockets, not nights. The exhaustion wasn't the hardest part. It was watching her children grow up faster than they should have. Jenna became the second adult in the home, mastering the quiet art of responsibility children should never have to learn. She'd warm a pot of mac and cheese, read Miles a bedtime story, and help Aiden memorize fractions, all before finishing her own homework by the light of a flickering lamp. One evening, Hannah came home to find Jenna curled over her textbooks, fast asleep, a bowl of cereal sitting untouched beside her. That moment cracked something inside Hannah, a realization that survival has a cost, and too often children pay part of it. But it was the middle child, Aiden, who voiced the truth none of them wanted to admit. One cold December morning, he stared at his worn-out shoes and whispered, "Mom, can you just tell us when things will be normal again?" There was no anger in his voice, only a small, quiet hope. That was the part that hurt most. Bills stacked up. The cabin leaked when it rained. Some nights the power flickered, and there were moments Hannah sat on the bathroom floor after the kids were asleep, just breathing through the panic, reminding herself that she was still here, still trying. In America, nearly 2 million women fall below the poverty line within a year of losing a partner. Hannah had become one of them, not because she failed, but because the world around her didn't leave room for her grief. Still, there were small victories: a raise of 50 cents at the grocery store, a bag of hand-me-down clothes from a coworker, a school counselor who offered after-hours tutoring for Jenna. Hannah learned something important during this time. When life strips everything away, the smallest kindnesses suddenly become anchors, and those anchors matter. The hardest moment came 3 years into their struggle. 3 winters, 3 birthdays, 3 Christmases spent in a cabin that never quite felt warm. Jenna, now 13, came home from school, set her backpack down carefully, and said, "Mom, I think I should quit school and work with you. I can help." She said it gently, as if she were offering a solution instead of giving up her childhood. Hannah felt the floor tilt beneath her. Pride and fear collided in her chest, and she told Jenna no, softly at first, then firmly. But Jenna's eyes filled with tears anyway. "It just feels like nothing gets better," she whispered. Every parent has a moment when they realize the weight they're carrying has begun to fall on the people they're trying to protect. For Hannah, that was the moment she felt something shift inside her, a whisper that said, "This can't be the rest of our story." She didn't know how to fix it yet. She didn't know about the cedar box waiting in the corner of their tiny living room. She didn't know it held the first crack of light she'd seen in years. All she knew was that poverty had pushed her to zero, stripped her pride down to threads, and forced her to learn a truth so many single mothers learn in silence. Survival isn't about strength. It's about refusing to stop, even when stopping feels easier. And just when it seemed like nothing would ever change, life, quietly, without warning, placed something on a high shelf, then waited for the right moment to let it fall. That moment was coming soon. In part 3, the cedar box that had gathered dust in their cabin would open, and everything they thought they knew about the Carter family, about power, and about what belonged to them. For 3 years, the old cedar box sat untouched in the corner of the cabin, half hidden behind a stack of donated blankets and a plastic bin of winter clothes. It had followed Hannah from the farmhouse on the night she left, tucked under her arm without much thought, mostly because it was one of the few things that still smelled like the past, like Luke, like home, like a life that had slipped through her fingers faster than she could hold it. She never opened it. In truth, she didn't have the emotional room to. Between double shifts, overdue bills, and the constant ache of watching her kids grow up under the weight of scarcity, anything that reminded her of the Carters felt too heavy to touch. But life has a strange way of nudging the things we avoid straight into our hands. One icy January evening, Hannah was dragging an old cardboard box onto the shelf above the washing machine when the cedar box tumbled from the top, hitting the floor with a dull crack. The latch, rusted, stubborn, and untouched for decades, finally snapped. The sound was small, but it echoed through the tiny cabin like a bell. Jenna heard it first. "Mom, what was that?" she asked from the kitchen table, where she was helping Miles glue pieces of colored paper into a class project. Hannah picked up the cedar box, expecting to see the past spill out like a ghost. Instead, inside lay 3 things: a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with a ribbon, a brass key engraved with the number 147, and a small velvet pouch that felt heavier than it looked. Hannah sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. For a moment, she simply held the envelopes, feeling the ridges of the old handwriting beneath her fingers. They were addressed to "My grandson, Luke," but the one on top had a different line, one written in a softer, more personal script. "For the woman he loves." She opened that letter first. The handwriting inside belonged to Eleanor Carter, Luke's grandmother, a woman Hannah had only known through stories whispered in the family, stories filled with reverence and caution. Eleanor had died long before Hannah ever came into the picture, but every farmhouse portrait and every family tale made her seem more like a myth than a person. The letter didn't read like anything mythical. It read like a confession. Eleanor told the story of her own life before the Carter name, how she had inherited 40 acres of mineral-rich land from her father, land she fought to keep when she married into a family that believed women should hold memories, not assets. She wrote about negotiations with a small oil company in the 1960s, royalties she never mentioned to her husband, and the decision she made later in life to create the North Ridge Mineral Trust, an irrevocable trust designed to bypass family politics entirely. The trust was for Luke. And if Luke died, it was for the woman he loved and the children who came after him. Hannah read the letter 3 times. The words blurred, sharpened, then blurred again. She had known pain that hollowed her out. She had known fear that kept her awake at night. But she had never known this kind of shock, the kind that feels like someone turning on a light in a room you didn't know you were standing in. Inside the velvet pouch was a folded deed from 1957, crisp despite its age. It listed Eleanor as sole owner of the land, 40 acres north of the Carter property, land Hannah had never even known existed. Attached to it was a mineral rights contract with a faded company stamp and a handwritten note from Eleanor. Not all wealth is meant to be flaunted. Some is meant to protect. The brass key belonged to a safe deposit box at Frontier Bank in town. Hannah stared at it, suddenly aware that this discovery could mean everything or nothing. She had lived long enough inside the Carter shadow to know that just because something was written on paper didn't mean the world would honor it. Still, the discovery planted something inside her, tiny but unmistakable. Hope. Not the loud, celebratory kind, the quiet kind, the kind that breathes slowly, like a newborn, opening its eyes for the first time. She didn't tell the kids everything that night, but Jenna noticed the way her mother sat straighter, the way her eyes softened in a way they hadn't in years. "Mom," she asked gently, "is something wrong?" "No," Hannah whispered, brushing a tear with the back of her hand. "I think something might finally be okay." In the days that followed, the letter stayed folded in her coat pocket, close to her heart. Poverty teaches you to be skeptical of promises, but it also teaches you to recognize turning points. And this felt like one. What Hannah didn't know yet was that the letter wasn't just a doorway to the truth. It was a warning. Eleanor had written something in the final paragraph, something sharp enough to slice straight through the years. If you are reading this, it means the family has failed you. Be prepared. They will not let go easily. With those words echoing in her mind, Hannah made a decision. She would go to Frontier Bank. She would open that safe deposit box. She would find out what Eleanor had protected all these years. And in doing so, she would set in motion a chain of events that would drag everything hidden in the Carter legacy into the light. Now, with the cedar box open and the truth beginning to surface, we move to part 4, where history, law, and a forgotten inheritance. The following Monday, Hannah stood outside Frontier Bank with the brass key clenched in her fist, the morning air sharp against her cheeks. She felt like she was walking into someone else's life, someone stronger, someone unafraid, yet her hands trembled all the same. Grief had turned her into a survivor, but this moment forced a new identity onto her, a woman who was finally ready to look her past in the eye. The clerk led her down a quiet hallway lined with vault doors, each one holding a different family's secrets. When the box marked 147 slid forward on the metal rails, the sound echoed like a door unlocking inside her chest. Inside the safe deposit box lay a neat stack of documents, all protected in plastic sleeves, as if someone had known they were meant to outlast fights, marriages, and even entire generations. At the top was a letter from Frontier Bank, dated 1973, confirming the creation of the Northridge Mineral Trust. Below it were notarized copies of the trust itself, stamped by a judge who had long since passed away. But the signature at the bottom, Eleanor M. Carter, felt alive, as though she were still reaching across time to pull Hannah forward. The trust was unlike anything Hannah had ever seen. It had language crafted with the precision of someone who'd lived enough to anticipate every angle of greed, every whisper of manipulation, every claw that might reach for what wasn't theirs. Eleanor had built the trust like armor, thick, impenetrable, and designed to stand even when people didn't. She had designated Luke as the sole beneficiary, and if he passed, the trust flowed directly to his legal spouse and any children he left behind. No loopholes, no conditions, no room for family politics. In a world where wealth often slipped through fingers simply because someone didn't know how to hold a pen, Eleanor had written a fortress. The documents also listed revenue summaries from the earliest oil extractions, numbers that meant nothing to Hannah at first. $2,300 from the first quarter of 1965, $7,800 a year later, rising sharply through the 70s and early 80s. But in the back of the binder was a newer sheet, printed only a few years before Luke's death, showing royalties from a modern energy firm that had acquired the drilling rights. The number at the bottom was so large, Hannah had to blink. 3.2 million annual royalties. It wasn't an estimate. It wasn't theoretical. It was real income that had been accumulating quietly in the trust, untouched. There was also a geological survey report of the 40 acres Eleanor had kept separate from the Carter property. The survey, conducted long after Eleanor's death, estimated newly discovered reserves beneath the land, reserves that modern extraction companies valued at tens of millions more. If the estimates were accurate, the trust wasn't just a financial cushion. It was generational power, the kind the Carter family had spent decades believing they controlled. Hannah's breath caught, not because of the money, but because she finally understood something. Eleanor had known. She had seen the cracks in her own family, the hunger for status, the pride that swallowed kindness whole. She had created the trust not to reward wealth, but to protect the only people who wouldn't be protected otherwise, the children and the woman who would love her grandson without motive. There was a note folded inside the binder, written in the same elegant handwriting from the cedar box. Blood does not make a family worthy. Character does. This land belongs to those who will honor it. Hannah pressed the note to her chest. For the first time since Luke died, she felt something stronger than fear. Validation. Someone, even decades ago, had believed she deserved more than the world was giving her. And that belief had survived every storm, every funeral, every secret, and every attempt by the Carter legacy to bury the past. The trust had refused to die. But truth, especially truth with this much weight, is never gentle when it meets the world. And as Hannah left the bank with a folder clutched tightly in her arms, the reality settled in. She wasn't the only one who had been searching for that land. Rumors had been swirling quietly for years. Developers scouting the North Ridge, a gas company eyeing expansion, and the Carter family pushing for title searches behind closed doors. They had sensed something, and soon they would sense her. Still, the moment held its own lesson. Sometimes power is passed not through inheritance, but through intention. Sometimes the most radical act is a woman choosing exactly who her legacy will protect. Eleanor had done that, and because of it, Hannah's life was no longer confined to survival. She wasn't just fighting for a cabin roof and overdue bills anymore. She was standing at the edge of a long-hidden history, holding proof that she and her children had never been the outsiders the Carters made them feel like. They were the rightful heirs of a lineage built on resilience, foresight, and a woman's refusal to let her family be swallowed by their own ego. With trembling but determined hands, Hannah walked out into the winter sunlight, the trust documents pressed to her chest. She didn't know how to confront the Carter family, and she didn't know what kind of legal storm was coming. But she knew one thing clearly. She would no longer move through life as a woman who had to ask permission. And with that new clarity, she quietly stepped into the next chapter, Part 5, where the bank, the law, and the truth would collide in a way that would change everything she thought she understood about power, inheritance. 2 days after discovering the trust, Hannah returned to Frontier Bank with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. The Montana sky hung low and gray, the kind that made the whole world feel quieter, like it was holding its breath. She walked through the glass doors, holding her binder of documents, her palms damp despite the cold. This wasn't just about money. It was about proving once and for all that her life had not been the mistake the Carter family painted it to be. The bank manager, a middle-aged man with wireframe glasses and a voice that carried the weight of decades in finance, greeted her with a polite nod. His nameplate read Harold Winslow, and something about the steadiness in his eyes eased her nerves. He led her into a private office with tall windows overlooking the snowy street. On his desk sat a stack of reference books, a state statute binder, and an old, heavy safe deposit ledger that looked like it had lived through a century of secrets. Hannah handed him the trust documents. He adjusted his glasses, flipped open the binder, and began to read. Minutes passed in silence, long, slow minutes, punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper. He checked signatures, compared dates, cross-referenced account numbers, even pulled an original microfilm record from the 1970s. With each page he verified, her heartbeat quickened. When he finally looked up, he took a slow breath before speaking. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I don't use this phrase lightly, but what you have here is ironclad." She blinked. "Meaning?" He tapped the trust with the back of his pen. "This is valid, fully intact, legally enforceable." Eleanor Carter was meticulous, almost prophetic. She structured this to survive death, disputes, family interference, even changes in state law. The trust belongs to you and your children. And the mineral rights, those alone, could be substantial. It was the first time in 3 years someone had used the words "belongs to you" without hesitation. Harold then opened a separate file, thick, labeled, and sealed with the bank's crest. "Now," he continued, "there's something else you need to see." Inside was the current balance of the trust account. The number didn't make sense at first. It was too long, too surreal, too out of place in her world of overdue rent notices and dollar store groceries. She counted the digits again, slower this time, steadying her breathing as her eyes widened. $11,182,000. Not theoretical, not projected, not some maybe someday inheritance. This was accumulated, sitting, real. Her hands shook so violently she had to grip the edge of the table. "That can't be right," she whispered. "It is," Harold answered, And based on the latest royalty reports, that figure will continue to grow, possibly dramatically. He paused, then added something that would forever change how Hannah saw her place in the world. You're not just a beneficiary, Mrs. Carter. You're the successor trustee. You have decision-making authority over the entire estate. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Years of exhaustion surged through her. Every night she had cried quietly. Every shift she had worked half asleep. Every birthday where she had apologized for not having enough. And now, a stranger was telling her that she was responsible for a fortune larger than anything she had ever dreamed of. But with the shock came fear, a deeper, colder fear than she expected. Will they contest it? She asked. Wayne, Marlene, Derek. Harold folded his hands. They may try. Families often do, especially when wealth surfaces unexpectedly. But Eleanor built this trust to withstand exactly that. The more they push, the clearer her intentions become. He glanced at her gently. You're protected. Legally, you have nothing to fear. But Hannah knew better. Legal safety was one thing. Emotional war was another. Outside the window, snow began to fall. Slow flakes drifting like tiny reminders that life could shift quietly, unpredictably, and without permission. She thought of Jenna, of Aiden, of little Miles coloring on the cabin floor. She thought of the years they had spent scraping by, while a fortune sat untouched just miles away. Yet even as wealth opened its door, she felt the weight of a new responsibility settle over her shoulders. Money didn't erase wounds. It didn't fix broken relationships. It didn't rewrite the past. But it did give her something she hadn't had in years, the ability to choose her next move. Harold walked her to the door, offering his final reassurance. Take your time with this, he said. You'll need good legal representation, and you'll want to be strategic. But Hannah, this is real, and it's yours. You've been living in survival mode for so long. I imagine it's hard to believe something good could finally happen, but it has. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her face and grounded her. She clutched the binder to her chest and closed her eyes, letting the truth settle. She was no longer a woman scraping by at the bottom. She was standing at the threshold of a legacy built by a matriarch who saw her worth long before anyone else did. And with that realization, she knew there was only one path forward. She would protect her children. She would honor Eleanor's intentions. And she would face the Carter family head-on. Because Part 6 was coming. And it wouldn't be gentle. Next, the confrontation that would shake the entire lineage. The moment the Carters discovered the inheritance, they'd spent decades The day after Frontier Bank confirmed the trust, Hannah sat at her kitchen table long after the kids had gone to sleep, the binder open in front of her. The numbers didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was everything that would come next. The Carter family wasn't the type to sit quietly when something threatened their pride, and certainly not when millions of dollars were involved. She needed protection, someone who understood the law the way Eleanor understood people, someone who could turn these fragile documents into a shield. She found him almost by accident. A colleague at the diner heard her asking for recommendations and handed her a business card so worn it looked like it had survived a war. "Call him," the woman said. "He helped my aunt when her brothers tried to rip her out of her share of the ranch. He doesn't scare easy. The card read William H. Maddox, attorney at law, a name that meant nothing to Hannah then, but soon would. When she met him at his Missoula office the next morning, she expected someone polished and intimidating. Instead, Maddox looked like an old-school Montana lawyer straight out of the 1980s. A thick gray mustache, rolled-up sleeves, suspenders that had seen better days, and a coffee mug that said, "Don't confuse your Google search with my law degree." His handshake was firm but warm, his eyes sharp but kind. He glanced at the binder she brought, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Let's see what storm we're walking into." For the next hour, Maddox read in complete silence. No dramatic reactions, no gasps, just the steady turning of pages and the occasional grunt of approval, like a mechanic inspecting the engine of a very rare car. Finally, he leaned back, removed his glasses, and nodded slowly. "Hannah," he said, "you're sitting on the cleanest, best protected trust I've seen in 30 years. Eleanor Carter didn't just set this up. She engineered it. She anticipated every fight, every loophole, every greedy hand. This is the legal equivalent of a steel vault." Her breath shakily released. "But will it hold against the Carter family?" she asked. His smile was small but unmistakably confident. "Oh, I know their type. Old ranching money. Lots of pride. More ego than assets. They'll huff, they'll bluff, they'll threaten, but they don't have a legal leg to stand on. Your name is right here, in black and white. So is your kids. They can't contest bloodline. They can't claim precedence. Eleanor cut them out on purpose." Then his voice softened, unexpectedly gentle. "I'm sorry they let you struggle this long. You should have had access to these funds years ago, but we're going to fix that." It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging her suffering out loud. Maddox laid out everything they needed to do. File a notice of successor trusteeship. Notify the mineral rights company of the beneficiary transfer. Activate the trust. Income for immediate distribution. And finally, prepare for the confrontation with Wayne, Marlene, and Derek. He didn't sugarcoat that part. "They will come after you," he said plainly. "Not legally, they'll lose there, but socially, emotionally, through intimidation, through pressure. Families like this don't go down quietly." Hannah nodded. She already knew. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "But here's the thing," he continued. "The law doesn't bend for loud voices. It bends for paper. And your paper is airtight." That single sentence changed something inside her. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, pushed aside, dismissed, spoken over, that she almost forgot what it felt like to have someone stand up for her, not because they pitied her, but because the truth was finally on her side. Maddox wasn't just her attorney. He was her backbone in a world that had tried so hard to take hers away. Before she left his office, he said one last thing, tapping a finger on Eleanor's signature. "Remember this. The power they denied you was always yours. You're not stealing from them. You're reclaiming what was protected for you." Hannah drove home through falling snow, the road winding like a quiet promise. For the first time since Luke's death, she felt not just hope, but structure, direction, a path. She didn't know that within days, the Carter family would find out everything. And when they did, the storm Eleanor had predicted decades ago would finally arrive. Part 7 would begin with a knock on the door. This time, not from grief, The courtroom felt colder than any Montana winter Hannah had ever survived. Not because of the temperature, the heaters hummed steadily, but because of the atmosphere, thick with old grudges and unspoken history. The Carter family sat on the opposite side, lined up in a rigid row like they were posing for a portrait meant to intimidate her. Wayne, with his jaw clenched tight, Marlene gripping her handbag so hard her knuckles went white, and Derek leaning back with an arrogance that told the entire room he believed the outcome was already written in his favor. But this time, Hannah wasn't the trembling widow who had once stood in their doorway, begging for kindness. She sat beside Attorney William Maddox, her spine straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Every time the Carters glanced her way, she did something she never could have done 3 years ago. She held their gaze without blinking. The judge entered, a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. The kind of judge who had seen too many families torn apart by land, livestock, money, pride, 4 staples of Montana feuds. "Let's begin," she said, and the trial opened like a wound that had been festering for decades. Wayne's attorney went first, painting the Carters as victims of a miscommunication, arguing that Eleanor's trust had been an outdated relic, signed before any of the current family dynamics were established. He used phrases like accidental exclusion, clerical ambiguity, and intent not properly aligned with the estate's evolution. Every sentence was a polished attempt to turn greed into misunderstanding. But Hannah saw the truth in Wayne's tightening jaw. He didn't believe a word of his own lawyer's speech. He knew exactly what Eleanor had done, and he hated that a woman, especially one who had married into the family, had outsmarted him from beyond the grave. Then it was Maddox's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply stood, walked to the center of the room, and opened the binder. His voice was steady, deliberate, the tone of a man who didn't need theatrics, because the truth itself was enough. He presented Eleanor's signature, the notarized trust, the revenue statements, the mineral rights filings from the 1960s. The judge leaned forward as he read lines of ironclad language Eleanor had crafted, phrases like irrevocable, non-transferable, and direct succession to legal spouse. Maddox highlighted the structure of the trust that bypassed the family entirely, then looked directly at the Carter row and said, "This wasn't an oversight. This was intention." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Even the judge paused at that. Maddox continued, revealing how the Carters had withheld information from Hannah after Luke's death, how they had provided no notice of assets, how they had tried to evict her from the farmhouse without disclosing the existence of the trust, an act that bordered on fraudulent concealment. He spoke in facts, not emotion, but it was emotion Hannah felt rising in her chest as the truth finally found oxygen. Then the judge asked the question no one expected. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "would you like to speak?" Hannah rose slowly. Her heart pounded, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "I'm not here to take anything from them," she said. "I'm here because someone in their family believed I was worth protecting. Eleanor didn't do this to punish them. She did it because she saw ahead. She saw who I would become, and she saw what my children would need. I didn't ask for this fight, but I won't let her legacy be buried because it's inconvenient." Marlene scoffed loudly. Wayne's face flushed. Derek muttered something under his breath. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. "I've seen many families torn apart by money," she said. "But this isn't a matter of who deserves more. It's a matter of legal fact, and the law in this case is crystal clear." She turned to the Carter side. "The trust stands. All claims by the Carter family are dismissed." It was over. Not with cheers or dramatic embraces, but with a soft exhale from Hannah. An exhale that carried 3 years of fear, humiliation, and survival out of her body. Maddox placed a hand on her shoulder, a small gesture that felt like grounding after a long fall. The Carters erupted in whispers and angry murmurs. Derek shot her a look of pure venom as he stormed out. Marlene refused to look at her at all. But Wayne paused at the door, staring at Hannah with something almost like disbelief, maybe because he had finally realized he'd lost not just control of the land, but control of the story. And deep down, he knew the truth. Eleanor had chosen wisely. As the courtroom emptied, Hannah stayed seated for a moment longer. She wasn't thinking about the money or the land or the trust. She was thinking about the cedar box, about Eleanor's handwritten warning, about all the women who had ever been underestimated by a system built to shrink them. This wasn't just a legal win. It was the first time in her life she felt whole, seen, validated, and it was the beginning of something much bigger than a courtroom victory. Because Part 8 would take Hannah beyond survival, beyond justice, into the realm of legacy, where she would transform her newfound power into something larger than herself, something that would change not just her family, but the lives of. In the weeks after the trial, life didn't transform with fireworks or sudden luxury. It shifted slowly, quietly, like the way dawn creeps across a valley before anyone realizes the sky has changed. Hannah still woke early, still brewed cheap coffee in a dented pot, still drove her beat-up car down the gravel roads of Butte. But inside her, something fundamental had rearranged itself. For the first time in years, she was no longer fighting to survive. She was deciding how to live. The trust's first distribution came through in mid-March, and the deposit hit her account with a string of zeros she had stared at for nearly a full hour. Most people would imagine celebration, but Hannah just sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her mug, feeling the weight of responsibility settle like a mantle around her shoulders. Money wasn't freedom. Money was direction. And she needed to choose hers carefully. Her first instinct wasn't a new house or a new car. It was insulation, food security, a real bed for Jenna, a tutoring program for Aiden, a winter coat for Miles that didn't come from a donation bin. These weren't luxuries, they were corrections. A mother quietly fixing all the places where survival had left cracks. But she knew this story wasn't meant to end with her children simply being comfortable. Eleanor hadn't built the North Ridge Trust to create another Carter dynasty. She built it for protection, and Hannah felt an obligation to continue that legacy in her own way. It started with a conversation in the grocery store parking lot. A young mother, thin coat, toddler on her hip, was digging through her purse in frantic panic because she had realized she was short on money after already loading her groceries. Hannah recognized the look on her face instantly. She had worn that same expression 100 times herself. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and paid the difference. The woman cried, not from the money, but from the recognition, the reminder that someone saw her. That moment stayed with Hannah. She knew then that Eleanor's trust wasn't supposed to be hoarded. It was supposed to move. So she began to sketch an idea, rough, uncertain, but hopeful. What if North Ridge became more than land and royalties? What if it became a place, a literal refuge, a transitional housing program for single mothers, a career training center, a child care cooperative, a safe haven, built not from charity, but from dignity? Montana had one of the highest rates of homeless women with children in the region. Hannah read the statistics late into the night. Single mothers made up more than 60% of the families in shelters statewide. Many came from circumstances just like hers: widows, divorced women, women escaping abuse, women crushed beneath the weight of medical bills or job loss. The stories echoed her own, sometimes almost too closely. She returned to the North Ridge land, 40 acres of quiet hills guarded by winter pines, and stood at the center of it while the wind whipped her hair. The air smelled like cold soil and old roots. It was the first time she allowed herself to imagine something extraordinary rising from the ground beneath her boots. A campus for restoration. A place where no woman would ever again be told she had 7 days to leave her home. A living legacy that rewrote everything the Carter name used to represent. She hired architects, consultants, social workers. She sat through meetings where she still sometimes felt like an imposter, just the woman who used to wipe tables at a diner. But Maddox reminded her, again and again, you belong in every room you walk into from now on. And slowly she began to believe it. The new North Ridge Women's Center broke ground in late summer. Jenna stood beside her mother, wearing a hard hat almost too big for her head, while bulldozers rolled across the land Eleanor had tucked away like a secret. The first building would include long-term housing, the second, a child care wing, the third, a workforce development center with local partnerships already lining up to offer apprenticeships and training. News crews came, donations followed, and quietly, almost reluctantly, a few small letters began arriving in Hannah's mailbox, some from women thanking her for speaking openly about widowhood and poverty, some from mothers who had been inspired by her courage, and one, unexpected, unsigned, written in shaky handwriting, from someone who simply wrote, "I'm glad you found what the rest of us never had the strength to search for." The Carter family stayed silent, publicly at least. Privately, rumors swirled. Derek had left the state. Marlene had taken to calling the trust that woman's trick. Wayne was seen more often at the old ranch fence line, staring toward the North Ridge with a look that held more regret than anger. Maybe he finally understood that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you choose. As construction wrapped and the first families prepared to move in, Hannah returned to the cedar box, the object that had started it all. She placed it on the new community center's fireplace mantel, not as a relic of pain, but as a symbol of a woman whose power had lasted decades beyond her lifetime. She whispered a quiet thank you to Eleanor, not for the money, not for the land, but for believing that a woman like Hannah could someday build something that mattered. And, with that, she stepped into the next chapter, Part 9, where the ripple effect of one woman's courage would begin. 10 years passed in a way Hannah could never have predicted. Time didn't erase the struggles she once faced, but it softened them, turned sharp memories into gentle reminders of who she used to be and how far she had climbed. The new North Ridge Women's Center had grown from a blueprint and a dream into a full campus that buzzed with life. Children played in the courtyard where sagebrush once grew wild. Women attended job training classes in the building that sat exactly where an old mineral surveyor's trailer had rusted decades earlier. The land had shifted in purpose, reshaped by hands that knew what desperation felt like and what hope could build from it. Her children grew up watching all of it unfold. Jenna, once the girl who swept dust from a rundown cabin floor, had blossomed into a confident young woman with the kind of steadiness Hannah wished she'd had at that age. She graduated high school with honors, then college with a degree in social work, choosing to return not because she felt obligated, but because she felt rooted. Now, she ran the youth outreach program at North Ridge, guiding teenagers through the same emotional storms she had once navigated alone. People often said she had her father's calm, but it was her mother's fire they saw when she spoke. Aiden, the boy who once whispered, "Mom, when will things be normal again?" eventually realized that normal isn't something you find. It's something you build. He became fascinated with engineering and spent summers shadowing the construction teams that expanded the center each year. He earned a scholarship, then a degree in architectural design, and by 25, he had returned to Montana to design North Ridge's second campus in Billings. His buildings looked like hope made tangible, light-filled, practical, strong. And little Miles, who once believed their leaking cabin was a fort, grew into the kind of young man who never forgot where he came from. He chose environmental studies, determined to protect the land that had protected his family long before he understood its history. He worked with conservationists to restore the creek that snaked through the northern edge of the property. At 21, he presented a statewide proposal for sustainable land use, standing on the same soil that had once been the center of a bitter inheritance war. The town of Butte changed, too. At first, locals talked about Hannah in hushed tones, some skeptical, some curious, others simply stunned that a woman who used to bag groceries now managed a multi-million-dollar trust. But 10 years has a way of revealing character more clearly than any courtroom ever could. People saw the jobs North Ridge created, the families it stabilized, the ripple effect of what happens when a town invests in its most vulnerable instead of turning them away. Businesses that once struggled now had steady employees. Schools saw attendance stabilize because children finally had secure housing. Even the sheriff's department reported a drop in domestic-related calls from single mothers, a statistical shift that told an entire story on its own. Neighbors began taking pride in the center. Volunteers came to paint murals, plant gardens, tutor kids, host workshops. North Ridge was no longer Hannah Carter's project. It was a community pillar woven into the identity of Butte itself. Local journalists wrote pieces titled "The Ridge That Rebuilt a Town" and "A Matriarch's Legacy Reimagined." And then there were the women. Hundreds passed through the center in that decade. Some stayed for months, some for years. Some left quietly, rebuilding their lives step by step. Others returned to volunteer, donate, or simply sit with new arrivals and say the words Hannah once needed to hear. "You're not broken. You're just beginning again." One afternoon, 10 years to the day after the building opened, Hannah stood on the hillside overlooking the center. The air smelled like warm pine and distant rain. Below her, children were laughing near the playground, women were chatting outside the job training center, and the community garden hummed with bees and spring color. She held the cedar box in her hands, weathered now, its edges softer, its wood darkened by time. She had kept it all these years, not as a reminder of hardship, but as a guide, a compass, a voice from the past that had given her the courage to shape a different future. Sometimes she wondered what Eleanor would think if she could see this place now. Not the wealth, not the buildings, but the people healing inside them. She imagined the older woman smiling with that quiet, knowing expression she had carried through the old photographs. She imagined her saying, "I left you land, but you built something far bigger." As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the ridge, Maddox walked up the hill beside her, slower now, his hair completely white, but still carrying the same steady presence. "You've done good with it," he said simply. Hannah nodded, her eyes soft. "It stopped being mine a long time ago," she replied. "It belongs to every woman who ever walked through these doors." And that was the truth. The trust Eleanor created might have begun as a shield, but Hannah had turned it into a bridge, one that stretched far beyond blood, beyond legacy, beyond any feud the Carter name once carried. With the past at her back and the future rooted beneath her feet, she knew the final chapter wasn't about wealth or justice. It was about something more powerful and more fragile. What happens when a life rebuilt becomes a light that guides others home? And now, in part 10, we step into that final light, where Hannah's story becomes a lesson, a legacy, and a reminder that even the deepest wounds can grow into a decade after the courtroom victory, after the groundbreaking ceremonies, after the programs and expansions and late nights spent building something bigger than herself, Hannah received a letter she never expected. It arrived in a plain white envelope with handwriting she recognized instantly, tight, heavy, a little shaky. Wayne Carter. For a long moment, she simply stood at her kitchen counter, running her thumb across the edge of the paper. The past never truly disappears. It circles back, testing who you've become. She opened the letter slowly, half bracing herself for accusation or bitterness. Instead, there were only 4 short lines. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say, but I know what I should have said years ago. I'm sorry. Wayne." The apology felt like a stone rolling loose, after decades stuck in the same place. Not because it erased anything he'd done. It didn't. It didn't give her back the home she lost, the nights she cried on the bathroom floor, or the childhood her kids had to grow through instead of grow in. But it acknowledged something she had long stopped expecting, that even the hardest people eventually hear the truth echo back at them. For days, Hannah carried the letter in her pocket, uncertain what to do with it. Revenge would have been easy. She could have written back, listing every moment he had humiliated her, every time he made her feel small, every choice that pushed her and her children to the edge. She could have reminded him that the land he dismissed as worthless was the very land rebuilding the lives of women he never cared to see. But she also knew this. If she allowed her life to circle around bitterness, then the Carters would still control her story. And she was no longer the woman they had once pushed into silence. So one crisp autumn morning, she drove to the Carter Ranch. The same gate she had once passed through with fear now stood before her like a relic of a world she had outgrown. Wayne was waiting on the porch, older, thinner, humbled, not defeated, just human, in a way he had never allowed himself to be. When she stepped out of the truck, he removed his hat, an old Montana gesture loaded with unspoken meaning. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I didn't come for closure," she replied. "I came because I refuse to let the past define what comes next." They sat on the porch, two people linked by a man who had loved them both, and by a land that had reshaped their destinies in opposite directions. Wayne confessed he had known about the trust rumor for years, but never believed it. He admitted he'd viewed Hannah as someone temporary, someone who didn't fit the Carter lineage, someone whose presence felt like a threat rather than an expansion of the family. "I was wrong," he said, voice breaking. "You honored this family's legacy more than any of us ever did." Hannah didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because she understood something powerful. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the wound. It's about choosing not to let it grow roots. She told him about North Ridge, about the lives rebuilt, about the women who arrived with nothing but a bruised spirit and left with their heads held high. She told him how Eleanor's trust had become more than wealth. It had become a mission, a promise fulfilled in ways the old matriarch likely never imagined. Wayne listened, hands trembling slightly on his knees. "Eleanor would be proud," he whispered. "So am I," Hannah said softly, not for him, but for herself. Before leaving, she walked the fence line behind the old barn, the place where Luke once carved their initials into the wood. Time had worn the letters, but not erased them. Grief softened. Love stayed. And Hannah understood that her life had expanded beyond loss, beyond anger, beyond anything the Carter family had tried to limit her to. When she returned to her truck, Wayne called after her. "Why did you come?" She paused, looking back at the man who once held the power to break her life in two. "Because I didn't want to teach my children that strength comes from winning," she said. "I wanted them to see it comes from choosing what kind of person you become after the fight." And that was the truth. Her greatest victory wasn't the trust, the land, or the success of North Ridge. It was the choice she made in that moment to close the chapter without closing her heart, to honor the past without living in its shadow, to rise without stepping on anyone else. Years later, when Hannah told this part of the story to new women arriving at the center, she never mentioned the trial, the numbers, or the bitterness. She spoke only about renewal, how life will always give you a moment that asks who you want to be, and how that choice ends up shaping everything that comes after. Because in the end, legacy isn't built from revenge. It's built from the courage to turn pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom, and inheritance into impact. And that is the story of Hannah Carter, a woman who lost everything, gained more than she could imagine, and chose not victory, but transformation. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Hannah's place?